Hello, thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe and comment, and also consider becoming a patron. Links in the description below. Edward IV claimed the throne of England after his victory at the slaughter of Towton, which was the bloodiest battle to ever be fought in England. Edward's father, Richard, Duke of York, had been challenging the Lancastrian monarchy for a number of years before he was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460. Just 3 months later, his son, Edward, Earl of March, finally deposed the hapless Henry VI and became Edward IV. This is the story of his reign. Whilst the circumstances surrounding Edward's succession were not overly promising, chronicles of the time tell us that the people of England were more than ready for a period of calm and stable governance. The nobility had been at odds with each other since the end of the 100 Years' War in 1453, and the infighting was becoming ever more destructive. Henry VI was out of his depth as king, so the common people would have hoped for, in the shape of Edward, a young man who could unify the country, even though he was still only 18 when he became king. One letter written at the time states how the people loved and adored him. Descriptions of Edward were predictably flattering. He was tall, handsome, elegant, and in the flower of his youth. He was also said to be valiant and unblemished in character, although that last characteristic is not quite true. Edward liked to indulge, and his love of food would bring his reign to a premature conclusion in 1483, when he literally ate himself to death. And even though he was a generally affable man, you would not want to get on the wrong side of his ferocious temper. However, you do get the general idea that he was a likeable young man. And here was a young man, vigorous, proactive, and a leader of men as well. Everything that Henry VI hadn't been. After his coronation in the summer of 1461, Edward made his brothers, George and Richard, Dukes of Clarence and Gloucester, respectively. Richard of Gloucester, whilst Edward was alive anyway, served the king with loyalty. George, though, would do no such thing, and he would prove to be a total pain in the backside for Edward. A whole host of Edward's other supporters were also given titles, many of whom were raised from humble backgrounds. Edward's most important ally, though, was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and known to history as the Kingmaker. Warwick was an extremely powerful and wealthy man. One chronicle describes him as being almost like a father figure to Edward as he grew up, with Warwick overseeing Edward's education. The deterioration of their relationship and Warwick's eventual going over to the Lancastrian side may well have been painful for Edward on a personal level, as well as being extremely dangerous to his political future and survival as king. What caused the breakdown in Edward's and Warwick's one-time friendship was thanks to, in Warwick's eyes anyway, Edward's betrayal, and making the Earl look rather foolish. Whilst Warwick was away in France to try and secure a great marriage for Edward, the king shocked the nation by secretly marrying a woman by the name of Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth came from a relatively obscure family and had already been married and widowed. This match was not seen as becoming of a king, but the couple produced a number of children together, including the tragic Princes in the Tower, and Elizabeth of York, who would marry Henry Tudor. Warwick was more than a little annoyed and quite possibly embarrassed by the developments on his return to England, and tension soon began to grow between himself and the king. Edward's marrying of Elizabeth was blamed largely on his youthful vigour and lust, as he had only just turned 22 at the time of the wedding. What it had done, aside from causing problems with Warwick, was cost Edward a potential powerful ally he might have gained had he married a foreign princess. Elizabeth's humble family would also benefit hugely from her sudden elevation to Queen Consort. In 1468, Edward did gain an ally, the Duke of Burgundy, who married Margaret of York, Edward's sister. But politically, things were very tense in England by this point. Edward was becoming increasingly unpopular, and he was growing ever suspicious of his brother George and his relationship with the Earl of Warwick. And Edward was quite right to mistrust them. In 1469, George married Warwick's daughter, Isabel. This was a potential deadly alliance against the king. Trouble was brewing for Edward, and at the Battle of Edgecote, a royalist army was defeated by the mysterious rebel Robin of Redesdale. Edward survived this setback, but matters were becoming increasingly desperate for him. After the battle, the Queen's father and one of her brothers were executed. This is a huge undermining of Edward's authority. But in 1470, the unthinkable happened, and things became even more perilous. Warwick had a pact with Margaret of Anjou, the Queen of Henry VI, to reinstate Henry as king and overthrow Edward in the process. This comes as a particular surprise, as Warwick and Margaret absolutely hated each other. It's an indication of how desperate they had become and how low they would stoop to regain power. The pact was made, and Warwick, George, and Margaret launched their invasion of England. Warwick and George set sail from France and landed in the West Country. Edward only just got wind of this invasion in time to avoid capture, and he fled from his kingdom to Flanders. Warwick and George made their way to the Tower of London, where the fragile Henry VI awaited them. He was now, once again, king. The French king, Louis XI, promised to continue to support the reinstated regime. Margaret and Warwick, however distasteful it may have been to them, may now have considered their agreement as being worthwhile. Meanwhile, soon after the reinstatement of Henry VI, a baby was born at Westminster. This was Edward, the oldest son of Edward IV and Elizabeth. The deposed king had missed the birth of his heir. However, he would return.